I'm glad to see a good turnout this morning. I welcome you all. This is our speaker this morning is Dottie Boatman. Dottie prefers that sort of nickname over her official name, Dorothy. She's a retired scientist from the University of Wisconsin, specializing in assisted reproduction technology. And during her retirement, she decided to focus on problems that have major impacts on the planet and all its flora and fauna. And since she lived in her early years in New Mexico and California, she's become particularly interested in water issues and of the West, and that'll be her topic today. She has spoken on this a year or two ago, but a lot is happening out there, and so it's good to have this update. And so, Dottie, I welcome you to today's talk, and thank you for offering to bring us an update. So you have the floor.
Well, I think I will go ahead and share screen at this point, assuming I can actually find my presentation.
Okay.
Got it.
Yep.
Okay. Let's see. Wait 1 second. It's not doing what I told it to do.
Fill the screen.
For the presentation mode, you can also go to the little.
Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, you got it. Good job. All right.
There you go.
I'm going to give a little bit of a preamble, a kind of weasel statements before I begin about the difficulties of covering an ongoing situation which hasn't yet resolved. The majority of the action that I'm reporting actually has happened since January of this year, although the planning stages have gone back to 2006, 2008, 2009. One of the both advantage and disadvantage is the sheer volume of news articles that have appeared. I counted up the number of bookmarked sites that I had actually saved. I think I read more, and there were 69 of them. And obviously not all of the material that I looked at was new or fresh, but it made it kind of hard to sort out. I also realized that if it weren't for the vagaries of trying to do a multimedia presentation, which I did on my last presentation, we could probably cover all of the issues with one of the nice YouTube videos, a 20-minute video. And there were several different ones. I can't say in particular. There was one that was particularly good that appeared in the Los Angeles Times. But I found that it was extremely difficult to manage sharing YouTube material, and I was reduced to taking snippets of still shots from various things. So that's part of it. I also found an issue of the quality of information. Last week, I almost got derailed because one of my news sources reported that the contractor who was actually removing the dams, including the Iron Gate Dam, which is a large earthen dam, had dropped out of the project. What had happened is that they had changed their plans for how they're going to do it, and it has to go through federal approval procedures, and nothing can be done until each of the steps that are changed are approved. But it doesn't mean that they dropped out of the project and that all is lost. As a result of this sort of slanted news report, people who wrote in and gave comments were saying, plug the hole back up, sue everybody, sue the state of California, sue Oregon, sue all the contractors. I mean, it was just sort of outrageous. And then a couple of articles later, I found out that this is sort of a routine occurrence in any kind of large construction, deconstruction project, that there are revisions made all along the route, and the project continues to be on course. So those are some of the challenges that I faced during my gathering of the information for everybody. So I basically see my talk today in three parts: the history and background of the Klamath River Basin and their dams, it's a good portion of the actual slides, but in terms of time doing it, photographs of dam removal and explosions. I particularly like the exploding the dams part. And this is where not having the actual video is a little bit lost. It's a little more tedious doing slide by slide presentations. And then I will talk about the ongoing efforts for restoration of the Klamath River.
Dottie, will you be having a map anytime? To
Yes,
show
I
us where
will.
the Klamath is? Good.
Yes,
Looking
I
forward to
will.
that. Excellent.
And I am seeing, I'm seeing the side view of everybody. It's covering part of the slides that I see. Is it covering the slides as you see them?
I just have us over to the side. I don't have any slides covered at all.
Hey,
But is
Dottie,
it-
Dottie,
Yes, sorry.
if you
Yes.
go up to view up in the corner, one of the choices is putting the pictures on the side of your presentation.
I do have them on this slide, but since I have full screen for everything, it's actually blocking part of, I'll push them way over.
Yeah,
Okay.
you want side by side. See the side by side option up
Yes,
there?
I do see that.
That's what I
Sorry,
did.
right.
That moves you guys off the picture.
Thank you.
Okay, so basically four hydro dams have already been removed. The first dam was removed in 2003. The others began the deconstruction this January, and they're on the Klamath River in Northern California and Southern Oregon. Actually, three of the dams are in Northern California, and only one of the ones removed is slightly over the border in Oregon. As of today, this is the largest dam removal project in the world. Reasons that are given for removing the dams are due to pressure from native tribes and local fishermen due to decimation of the salmon populations. And also the amount of hydro that is produced by the dams, does not balance the cost of the upgrades in terms of providing fish ladders and environmental safeguards. And I'm going to give a little bit more information because Richard asked for this as to exactly how much power was provided and now will be lost, because our group gets very concerned anytime a carbon-free source of energy is lost. But basically, it's only 2% of Pacific Core, which is the company that owns them. It's only 2% of their customers' power supply. So you can see how they wouldn't want to put huge amounts of money into bringing them up to code. And to put it in a local perspective, with the enough power to supply 70,000 homes, I looked up, and this is about half the output of local MG&E. And I'm not sure how much of the total power MG&E provides for the city, because we also have Alliant Energy. So this is actually a relatively small amount of energy. Yes, Richard.
Could I add a little insert here, Dottie?
Yes.
Many of the class have been up to the hydro dam at Prairie du Sac, and that, by comparison, is 32 megawatts. So basically, this would be 3 times the size of the one dam, the dam that we've seen already. And
Okay.
so it's small by comparison to the total region, but it's 24/7, and it lasted for 100 years. I don't know if the ones out there last that long, but I wouldn't call it too insignificant. I mourn the loss.
Well, that's a matter of opinion, as they say.
But I like the fish too. I spent a summer out there studying the fish, so I'm torn. Go
Okay.
ahead. Sorry.
Additionally, the 4 dams on the Klamath inundate miles and miles of fish habitat for salmon and other species. It's 400 miles of habitat, 4 square miles total and 15 miles of river length. So this will be a very long amount of river length that will be freed up. The river salmon populations have been decimated. The coho are threatened, which is a lesser status, but the spring Chinook salmon are almost totally at extinction. They were once the dominant species, the dominant salmon species in the Klamath Basin, and they've decreased 98%.
Wow.
As an example of how dire this is, the York tribe, which has subsisted on the fish, particularly the Chinook, since times immemorial, they decided to suspend their subsistence fishing in 2023 for the first time in recorded history. So that means that they didn't take them at all for eating. And, that's in addition, they have rights in addition to commercial fishing. The Indians have a primary right to the fish by treaty and by precedent. So in reasons for removing the dams have all altered the river's temperature. In the fall, the water is much too warm, and this is when the fish return to spawn, and the higher temperatures cause adult stress and mortality. Conversely, during the late spring, the dams cause reduced water temperature, and this impedes the growth of the juvenile fish and reduces their survivability. So with this effective temperature, the dams are affecting both the fertility and the juvenile survivability. In addition, a very significant thing has happened. The warm temperatures and the stagnant water have caused massive blooms of toxic cyanobacteria or green algae, and I will show you an image of this. This is Iron Gate Dam before it was removed, and this is in the middle of summer. And you can see just how green it is. That is not an artificial enhancement or filter or anything of that sort. That's what the water actually looked like. So for those of you who think that the electricity was worth it, just look at that toxic brew. Additional reasons for removing the dams is that the Pacific Corps' federal license came up for renewal in 2006. And at this point, they had to make a decision about what to do. Were they going to put money in to bring them up to code or not? What they ended up doing is entering into a voluntary agreement called the Klamath Hydroelectric Settlement Agreement alongside federal, state, and local governments, tribal nations, 9 conservation and fishing groups in order to remove the dams. Even though they reached this agreement, this decision to remove the dams was up to Congress, and Congress did not act. Congress eventually, they found a means to bypass the need for congressional approval, and that's why they were able to begin removing them in 2003. Again, Pacific Corps concluded that by surrendering their license and discontinuing the operation, this was in the best interests of their customers and of the local people. There was some controversy, particularly in Siskiyou County, about removing the dams, but by and large, the overall populations of California and Oregon were in favor of removing the dams. I'm going to repeat this exactly. How has the population altered over the years of the salmon? Basically, they have fallen by 90% since the early 20th century during the period of times that the dams were built and in operation. To illustrate this pictorially, I obtained this data, which shows the current distribution and extirpation of the Chinook salmon in the Klamath River Basin, dating 2008. Obviously, things have progressed and are even worse as we are now into 2004, but this was the data I could find. I'd like you to focus on the upper basin here, the bright pink color and this orange and chartreuse color show that in the upper basin, in both seasons, spring and in fall, the Chinook are extirpated. They no longer are in the upper Klamath Basin at all. And in the lower basin, during the spring, they are largely extirpated. In certain parts of the range, they are extirpated, whereas the purple and green colors show existing populations. So you can see that there's very little orange and purple concentrations. The majority of it are the other colors, the pink, orange, and chartreuse, showing tremendous loss of range for the Chinook, as well as the numbers. This doesn't show the numbers, but obviously when they're not in their home range and they're lost from those areas, you've lost numbers too.
And could I raise a question? The
Yes.
4 dams that you're questioning are identified by little yellow boxes, correct?
The Iron Gate Dam is here. I will be showing pictures of the dams in a subsequent. I just wanted to show
Sure.
the dams are right in this area here in the junction between the two states.
Great. Now
Okay.
where you've got the turquoise down near the mouth of the river, are there dams there, or is that just wild?
No, the dams are up in this area. All of the
Okay.
dams are in the more northerly areas of the Klamath Basin.
Okay, so
I'm
so
not
the
sure.
fish in the dams can I'm sorry. So the fish will coexist in the turquoise areas down near the mouth of the river.
Well, when they come back in from the ocean, but they haven't really spent a lot of time getting further. The fish in the fall, the Chinook in the fall, can get as far up as the Iron Gate Dam, but they don't go any further. Is that clear? And then in the next slide, the coho, which are threatened and not yet toward extinction. Oh, there's somebody else to come in. The coho have never apparently had a big presence in the upper basin as historically, but this pink area was where they used to be, and now they are extirpated. The pink means gone. And they're also gone from portions of the lower basin as well. And there's still coho in a good portion of the lower basin. So they're threatened, but not yet extinct. So this is a pictorial illustration of decimation of the salmon. Now, the question is, are the hydroelectric plants the sole reason for the water problems in the Klamath River Basin? And this is something that I actually was confused about myself until the end of last week. The penny finally dropped. I hadn't realized that the hydro dams are not actually part of the federal government's Klamath River project. There are 2 separate programs. One is the hydro plants, which are privately owned, and they were originally owned by California Oregon Power Company, which is now Pacificorp. And there are water project dams that were constructed by the Federal Bureau of Reclamation. Now, we are not, the Federal Bureau of Reclamation's dams are an issue for water quality and for water control throughout the whole basin, but they are not the subject for dam removal. All of the dams that are being lobbied against are the hydroelectric dams. And I think partly it's because they're bigger. We saw the huge algal bloom behind in the reservoir area of the Iron Gate Dam, and they clearly are at fault in many ways, but I found no information about these other dams that belong to the power project. The two programs have separate purposes. Obviously, the hydropower dams are to generate hydropower, and the water project dams are to conserve water and to create new farmland. But even though they're two programs, they each affect each other dramatically. This shows the basin as a topographical type of map, showing the upper basin here, the various river flows with the Klamath finally flowing to the ocean. And this just gives you an idea of the extent and the topography. This is very flat land here, very arid, and you can see many more mountains in this lower region. So they are distinctive in their topography. Now, the hydro dams were all owned by Pacific Corp, of which they owned 6 project dams, and they co-owned and shared a dam called the Link River Dam with the Bureau of Reclamation. They have one dam actually one dam left that is generating power, and apparently it has generated the majority of the power for Pacific Corp, and that's on Fall Creek, and I have not located it on any of the maps. The others, which are being removed, are the Copco Dam number 1, which was completed by 1916. And Copco 2, also completed soon around that time, both for hydropower, and the Copco Dam impounded Copco Lake. Then there is a Link Dam, which was completed in 1921, predominantly for flood control and water storage, and secondarily for hydropower generation. This dam is not under consideration for removal. And the other 2 dams, which are the larger dams, are the John C. Boyle Dam and the Iron Gate Dam. And then there is another dam, which I don't understand exactly. It doesn't generate power, but it's still, it replaced an older dam, and it belongs to Pacific Corp, but I don't really know what its purpose is. So this shows that where the dams are located. The Link Dam, which is co-owned, is the furthest north, and the John C. Boyle Dam is in Oregon, and the other 3 dams are in California. And these listed here with the purple line are the ones that have been removed. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Klamath project, because even though it is not part of the hydro dams, it is part of the problems that the hydro dams actually had politically. The Klamath project was developed by the United States Bureau of Reclamation in order to provide farmers with irrigated water and to actually drain marshes and produce farmland in the Klamath Basin. They also supply water to the Tule Lake National Wildlife Refuge and to the Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge. And these refuges are important because I'd like to repeat that the Klamath Basin is considered to be the Everglades of the West. I hadn't realized it was that important, but it is a tremendous flyway for ducks, geese, birds, and a variety of other species. So it's an extremely important area for nature. Now, the Klamath project actually has almost as many dams as the hydro dams, but they are really not at question. They're not shown on the maps that I saw. And aside from placing them here so that you can see what they are, we're really not going to talk about them. But I want you to know that they actually have more dams, and they will have the majority of existing dams on the Klamath now that these hydro dams have been replaced. I think that they are all probably lower dams and smaller dams, et cetera, and quite different in their structure than the ones that were owned by Pacific Corp.
You think they will have fish ladders?
I don't think that they will require fish ladders. I don't think that that's an issue.
Okay,
Well,
thank you.
As I said, I was totally confused that
Yeah.
it all wasn't one big project and
Yeah.
that it was two separate things until recently.
Yeah.
but
And just to show you how extensive the Klamath project is, the Bureau of Reclamation negotiated to have land ceded underneath, underlying the lower Klamath and the Tule Lakes to the federal government, and they received approval to destroy the navigability of the lower Klamath and Tule Lakes by draining them. 185 miles of main canals exist, 680 miles of lateral canals, and 728 miles of drain ditches with varying depths were constructed, and they effectively replumbed the Klamath Basin. So by 1957, a point that they touted and were very proud of was that 500,000 acre-feet of water, which, quote, was formerly entirely wasted, was being successfully conserved by being applied to irrigated agriculture. So you can imagine how this tremendous diversion of water has changed the entire area over time. And this had nothing particularly to do with Pacific Corp and its predecessor, but had to do with federal government policy. The over
Dottie?
200, yes, sorry.
Dottie, this is Steve Shellen. The problem is, and this is also in the Columbia River tributaries, the spawning takes place at the upper end in the lower water level, marshy areas, low flow portions, and those sorts of diversions isolate those from the fish.
Yes,
So
and
you may
also
have
Correct.
80,000 acres that are now farmed, but you have 80,000 acres that are not fish habitat.
exactly, they're not fish. They basically removed the area of the lakes where they were, and you've also removed some of the water that would be in the tributaries where the young will be. So you've totally changed the hydrology of the whole area. And there is considerable money from the federal government for restoring the entire Klamath Basin. And obviously it's going to involve the Klamath project, not just the hydro dams, but I can't really go into it. I just want people to realize that there are sort of two actors there in this story. And the federal government and its programs basically changed an area which was arid and very low habitat, very poorly populated, into an area that became suitable for farming. People are dependent on the farming. It created new uses for the water, and it set up a potential for conflict between the users and lovers of the natural river and the fish and the agricultural people who want the water. One of the things that the Klamath Project provided for was two national wildlife refugee areas, which are visited by game birds every year. So going on, a lot of land was opened up to be used for farming and irrigation, 200,000 acres or so, and also 86,000 acres of national wildlife refugee lands. And it provides water to them but only when available to the National Wildlife Refugee lands. This becomes an issue. The Bureau of Reclamation has an obligation to deliver water to the project users pursuant to their project water rights and their contracts between the Bureau of Reclamation and the water user, again, subject to the availability of water. Basically, what has happened is that there is not enough water for everybody, and who has water rights and who comes first is a very, very major issue. This has resulted in ongoing adjudication of water rights and litigation, and the current order of priority for how water will be provided is the following. Number one, any species listed under the Endangered Species Act have first priority. Number two, the treaties and trust arrangements with the tribes have the second priority. The third priority is the contract irrigation water, and the last priority is the National Wildlife Refuges, which are a birthplace for many of these species, not only in the West, but all over the nation. One of the things that is unusual about these two national wildlife refuges, which are in the Klamath Basin, is that they are still permitting farming on their lands. And so all the toxins from farming are going into the water and affecting the breeding animals. So there are a lot of issues with water. Again, not all of it was Pacific Corps' responsibility. This led to a nationwide controversy that involved the Klamath Project. After the lost nose and the short nose suckerfish were listed as being endangered in 1988, and with decreasing salmon runs, the scientists employed by the Bureau of Reclamation decided to cut off irrigation water to local farmers in 2001. Obviously, this led to an enormous outcry by the farmers and the citizens in the area involved, particularly in Siskiyou County. They complained to their congressional representatives, and the decision was reversed the next year, and the water was returned to irrigation. During that year, as a result of the low water and high temperatures in the lower reaches of the river during the salmon migration, a massive die-off of the salmon occurred. I forget exactly how many. I think it was in the thousands, 30,000 of just a huge amount of the salmon showed up dead. And the study showed that the drought conditions and the low flow were among the factors that caused gill rot disease to attack the salmon population. Now, there was so much discord about what had happened with turning off the irrigation water and the fish that the National Research Council intervened in order to examine whether their scientists had made correct decisions. First, the scientists were vilified when they terminated irrigation, and then when it seemed that their decisions had been justified in withholding the water with the fish kill that occurred in 2002. However, the National Research Council came up with sort of a wishy-washy decision in which they determined that the decision to stop the delivery of the irrigation water in 2001 had not been scientifically justified. And I read the report and I can't really explain it. And then they also decided that the fish kill in 2002 was an unfortunate consequence of natural events. I think nobody was happy with what had happened, and nobody was happy with the decision of the National Research Council on either of these. And this led to what's happened next. This fish kill was the initiating factor in the movement to remove the hydro dams. Even though these were decisions made by the Bureau of Reclamation, this started the tribes and fishermen to begin their lobbying efforts for removal of the dams. Okay, for some reason we're going backwards. And again, reminding you of where the dams are located in this key area right between the dry upper basin and the lower basin. In the previous talk I gave, I was explaining how one went about organizing to remove a dam. And as of this point, all of these events have either occurred or are occurring in terms of removing the hydro dams. The pre-planning process was extensive. It began in 2006 and hastened after 2009. So there was a considerably long period of time to gain public opinion and to make the plans for restoration following it. So there was an 8-year period of time for that. As of this spring, all of the dams have been drawn down, and one of the dams was removed last year. The removal, let's see, oops. The removal of dams is ongoing. 2 of the dams, the earthenware dams, no work has actually started on it. And the post-removal remediation and restoration of the landscape is currently taking place, even though the land has not completely settled down. So now we're going to just have the joy of seeing things being blown up and dismantled. I think anyone who has smashed a sandcastle in the sand after carefully building it up will kind of understand this. And it's just a pictorial display. There's no real information to be had. So here's Copco number 2. It was the first dam completed, and this is slightly before, this is before removal. And 1 year later, this is what it looks like. There's almost no evidence of any dam having been there at all.
Nice.
And we're going to see, I watched a video, which I wish that I could actually show to you, but again, since multimedia presentations don't seem to work very well for most of us in this class, it didn't work very well for me the first time I did it. We're just going to have to go with the slides, and this happened over 5 months. So here we are, mostly still have a dam. Still doesn't look like much is done. You can tell if you look closely that work's been done. Here we see now the water's gone. Things are really happening. Here they have ground away a lot of the concrete here, this portion of the dam. Here it's looking like a Roman ruin with pillars now almost gone. Here the cranes and the diggers are doing the last of the removals. And by fall, we have a nice freely flowing river at that spot. It looks almost like nothing had been there before, except you can still see some equipment here on the side. Now we're going to watch the Iron Gate drawdown, and this is kind of the actual, once it's drawn down, this is the biggest dam of all, but it's not going to be, here we can see it, but what we're going to see during the drawdown is actually the view of a tunnel. There was a plug in the tunnel that was removed, so we won't actually see the dam per se, but we will see the aftermath of what's happening. So here we go, watching in the tunnel. You can see that there's not a tremendous amount of water. And here the water is starting to rush through and rush through. And this is This tunnel will become important in the later part of the story. So nothing too dramatic in terms of what one could see with that particular dam removal. Now we'll move on to the Boyle Dam. There will be a little bit more activity there. Here we're at the top of the dam. We're looking into this area. They obviously must have done this in the middle of the winter. I'm not sure exactly when this was. Here we can see the puffs of smoke and from the blasting, probably also mixing with some of the fine particles and debris. And you notice it's obscuring the area below it, completely obscuring it. Here we're starting to see more of that, but we're starting to see the water roiling underneath. Here we see much more of the water roiling, and so it's just pouring out now. So that's what that looked like. And then my favorite one is the explosion of Copco number 1. Here we go. We have a nice, you can actually see the little puff both at the top from the explosion, and it's blowing out at the bottom here. Now we see the water rushing. This is the most satisfying of all the slides. There it goes. And we have huge amounts of water coming through. So that's what the explosions look like. You would have enjoyed it a lot more had you actually been able to see the videos, but that's all I could do. So I want you to see now what the landscape looks like after the 4 dams have been breached. Here we have in February, a year ago of 2023, we see Copco Lake, which is impounded behind the Copco dams up here. And this is quite a good sized lake and supplied a lot of recreation. There are a lot of homes around Copco Lake. A lot of the people who live there were quite sad to see something happening to their lake. And then we see the Klamath River, and it is quite swollen in these pictures, followed by the Iron Gate Reservoir and the Iron Gate Dam. A year later, here we see these same areas. This is the area here where Copco Lake was, surrounded by the sort of white line around it. We see that the Klamath River is far less swollen, and we can hardly tell where the reservoir had been located, where the Iron Gate Dam has now been removed. So quite a dramatic change just visually in what's happened since the dams have been breached. And so the dams have been breached. They really haven't all, the structures haven't all been removed from the river, and that process is ongoing. So this restoration is being overseen by the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, and they have a number of subcontractors who are doing various things, such as actually physically removing the dam structures. And I believe they're also overseeing the various organizations that are doing the restoration of the flora and fauna on the riverbank sides. A lot of money, but I think a $50 million budget, well, it seems like a lot, given the size of the areas that need restoration, is still fairly low amount of money. A good portion of the money, I think around $300 million of the dollars, is coming from the state of California. And this is basically state money to remove private property. And the rest of the money is coming from surcharges that Pacific Corp has already obtained from its customers. Currently, on Copco number 1, dynamite is being used to fracture the concrete, and then it's being chipped away by machinery. This should be completed by the end of August. Copco 2 was removed last year. You saw the video for that. And the 2 earthen dams are to be dismantled starting in May, and there may be some delay on what happens in the dismantling of the Iron Gate Dam. That remains to be seen. Now, we are at a point where everybody's agreed we're going to do it. It's too late. We've blown the dams up. The water's gone. And what do we have left? We have a big mess. We have mud flats. We have a deer that got caught in the mud, and it made animal lovers very upset to see the deer trapped in the mud. We saw any number of fish, usually the non-indigenous, the non-native fish that a lot of the fisher people, the sport fishermen enjoyed, fishing for them, but they're not native to the area, and they're not the ones that the Endangered Species Act is applied to, and there were not real efforts made to safeguard these fish. So things are messy. Approximately 2.3 million tons of sediment have been released into the river. This has obviously changed the turbidity and a lot of the qualities of the river. It's not a particular time where anyone wants to put their canoe in and enjoy the river. So as I say, it's a messy period of time. However, they were not blind to choosing a time to do this. They chose January as optimal for beginning to empty the reservoirs. And they did this in the winter after the adult salmon had already spawned and died. And at the same time, sorry, did somebody say? Oh, sorry. At the same time, the newly hatched salmon remain in the tributary streams where they can feed and grow. So they're not in the main stem of the Klamath. And here we now see, this is the Iron Gate Dam, which had all that toxic algae. We saw it full. This is what it looks like after most of the water has been drawn down. And you can see the mudflats here that are all around where the river is flowing. But despite the fact that the mud is not completely dissipated or hardened or work is still ongoing. The crews from the Yurok tribe have been already walking in the mud and scattering seeds for native plants, including grasses, shrubs, and trees. Their efforts actually started several years ago when they began collecting in the Klamath area, collecting 13 million seeds. And they sent these seeds to farms where they were propagated and multiplied. This has resulted in 16 billion seeds being available for the restoration project. Already, helicopters have been used to drop seeds along the river. One of the reasons for the reseeding effort, one is to stabilize the wet sediment. And an important thing is also to get a head start for native plants, thereby preventing non-native weeds from taking hold. And this is an important thing to do. This was found after dam removal on the Elwha River in Washington State, where this pre-seeding was quite effective in cutting down on the weeds. This means that more of the native plants, like the blue bunch wheatgrass and the Oregon sunshine, will be present, and there'll be fewer weeds. In addition, within 10 years, it's expected that there should be trees along the riverbanks of the Klamath. So all is very hopeful. And here we see one of the Kurok tribesmen hired by the reclamation services is reseeding. And the seeds are taking root. These are tiny, tiny little seedlings as yet. You can see how muddy and wet things still are. And one of the organizers, the organization that's hiring the Kurok to do the replanting, is showing the seedlings as they're coming up. Here we see another plant, a slightly larger plant. And these are some of the plants that people want to have in the area. And quite honestly, I have no idea what plant that is, but it's a native plant, one of the ones that they're trying to encourage, as is this plant. And here we see some of the millions of seeds that were gathered and then propagated to be distributed. Now this brings us to the fish. Before the drawdown, efforts were made to mitigate any ill effects for the salmon. So the Curragh fisheries specialists waded into the water and they trapped the young salmon and moved them to holding ponds where they're to be kept until the water quality improves. However, there were some missteps that were made. 830,000 juvenile Chinook salmon from a fishery, the all-built fish hatchery, were released into a tributary of the Klamath, and they died after they went through that tunnel in the Iron Gate, which we showed you with the water rushing through. And they were autopsied, and it was found that they had gas bubble disease, which was caused by water supersaturated with dissolved gases. So all that roiling of the water and the spewing, the sheer force of the water caused this gas bubble disease. But all is not lost, because plans are made that young salmon will now be released significantly downstream of where the dam was until the dam is completely removed. And the dam, I don't know how long it will take to remove the dam. They thought it would be removed by the end of the year. I'm hoping that that's still holding. The hatchery still has millions of fish that are scheduled to be released later, so they didn't lose all of their stock. And despite the dam removal, there are still healthy wild salmon in the river, so it is not completely toxic in its present state for the salmon. I looked at some other dam removal projects. There was one in Oregon where the Condit Dam was removed on the White Salmon River. And 10 years, they were analyzing what had worked and what hadn't worked after 10 years. And what they found is that 10 years is too early to predict the future of salmon recovery, because the Chinook return to rivers between the ages of 3 and 6. So they need many more generations before we can tell whether removing dams is going to help with the recovery or not. But this is certainly being monitored, so we're quite hopeful. Now, not as a result of dam removal or keeping of dams, the core conditions in the entire basin have resulted in commercial fishing on the West Coast being suspended for the second year in a row. And this decision was made by the Pacific Fishery Management Council to do it. And it is possibly a death knell for many of the commercial and recreational fisheries. But it can't be helped. This article also stated that the Sacramento River watershed, and I'm not sure how that watershed intersperses in the Klamath Basin, but nonetheless, the watershed did provide the greatest proportion of salmon on the West Coast. It used to support between 1 and 2 million fish every year, but in 2023, there were only 134,000 adult fall-run Chinook, and this means that there are only 5 to 10% of what was previously there. So the fish have a long way to come back. And I'm showing you this. This is what people were seeing. What made a lot of people sad. We saw a lot of dead fish. These are largely the non-native fish that nobody made real effort to protect, but it's still quite disturbing sight for people to see dead animals, piling up, and before we see the benefits of the dam removal, we have to go through the pain, so to speak. Now, once everything is restored, significant new land has been, or land that had been inundated. It's not new land created out of nowhere. It's land that had been inundated. It will be available. But this has been ceded to California and Oregon and will be up to state decisions what the use of the land will be. The Shasta Indian Nation, one of the tribes, unlike the Yurok and some of the others, they basically were divested almost of all of their property during the period that the dams were put in place. And they have requested that some of the lands be returned to their people. So this will be an ongoing story, and I'll be interested to see what happens with the land. And I have finished my formal presentation, and I'm open to questions.
I have a question from Lee. She wants to know, what is a riparian forest?
That's forest along a riverbank.
Sure.
It's a
Good.
nice, yes.
Good. I looking for other ones here. Let's see. I think that's the only one. I have a question for you, Dottie. I worked out there in so many years ago, in 1955, I think, for the International Pacific Salmon Commission. And they were studying the Fraser River at the time. And what they found was that if they moved the eggs after they were hatched, they collected the eggs where they were spawning. They dropped the eggs into fertilized, and they're in the gravel, and they recover them gently and transplant them immediately to another branch of the same river that is more likely to be a good host for them.
Okay.
And in a particular branch of the Fraser where they were going to build an aluminum mine and would have ruined a stream, they were able to move them to an adjacent stream, and it worked. Unfortunately, my being only there one season, I did not have a long follow-up. But I got the impression that what was good about doing it right after the eggs were fertilized and before they had a chance to hatch is that you just have to do a one-time transfer, and the fish will come back to the same area where they hatched, that there is a homing taste preference, and so that you can suitably transplant them one time only, and nature will look after it from then on. Have you heard about that in your reading?
I think that what my understanding is that they raise the fish, they breed them in the hatcheries, and then the young fish, if they're put into particular tributaries and different places, they will return. I don't think that they actually have to physically be born there. I think they have to spend some time growing in the area that they then return to. And I didn't specifically look at that, but when I read about how they were saving these fish and then transporting them to different areas, that seems to be the way that they're doing it.
Yeah. Well, as you say, we have time on our hands to see how this is going to be successful. But I'm impressed by the efforts made to keep everybody happy. It is a hugely important issue. I think you've covered it very well. And also, what's interesting to me is the huge amounts of money spent and in efforts to keep everybody reasonably content. I mean, we're all living out there, and we don't like to have the things that are so important to us denied. And so people are working hard, it seems, to deal with the role of rivers, which change with time over the decades.
Well, I think that there's very possibly an urban-rural divide in terms of opinion. I did not go deeply into this, although, I encountered various articles along the way, and I found that polls were taken before the dams were removed, and the people in the counties involved, in Siskiyou County, I think 80% of the people who lived in the area who were polled were against removal of the dams. The populace of California in general was highly supportive, as were both recreational and commercial fisher people were for it, as were the tribes. So it is not, the majority are for it, but not necessarily the majority of the people who are directly around the reservoirs.
Right.
Don't want to give that opinion. And this remains, issues. The people who are eventually going to be kicked out of farming and the refuges are going to kick and scream like crazy, but their time is coming. I also heard that up to $1 billion, and I hope I've got the amount right, through all different kinds of federal agencies are eventually going to be applied to restoration of the hydrology of the entire Klamath Basin. So there's going to be, it's an ongoing thing. What seemed like a good idea to create more farmland, we didn't have the same knowledge base back in the early 20th century as we do today. And I think, so there's going to be a lot of mitigation, not just related to these dams that were removed, but to the whole basin. And I saw calls for grant applications for different things. And, so it's a major issue in the West. And I think the Bureau of Reclamation, with all of its dams and structures, has played a big part in making the West a livable place and a place that's fertile for agriculture, but it also did a lot that changed the environment, and it could be having effects on, combined with climate change that are making things worse. So I think there's attempts for mitigation. A lot of people are involved. It's quite a complicated area.
Yeah.
And the water rights thing, the water rights issues in the West are, I think you need to be a water rights specialist. I really didn't want to get into it, but a lot of the irrigators get very angry. They feel that the Indians have unjustified rights, but it was determined by the Supreme Court back in the previous century during litigation that the federal government didn't actually give rights to the native tribes. The native tribes never ceded their rights, that they had intrinsic rights that belonged to them, which included the subsistence fishing and other things. So it codified with the federal government the sort of separate nation status of some of the tribes with regard to land and property and decisions. And there continues to be, conflict between the farmers who basically newer comers, and they've bought land or had it. I think probably some of the veterans may have actually had land given to them or sold it to them at very low prices. But once you feel that you own something, you don't feel that the government has the right to take your water away, but it's a very complicated sort of thing. The government basically appropriated water that it didn't have a right to in the first place and gave it away to other people, and now people are unhappy. So I think it's interesting, but very complicated.
Yes. Well, thank you again. I think that's been a great insight to us all. It really is, and I appreciate your going through all the ups and downs and not forming a rigid opinion, but allowing us to see the complexity of the issue. Do I see any hands raised? Anybody want to raise a hand? I see a lot of you up there. Stephen, are you waving or are you asking a question?
I have a question, or
Sure.
rather some input. There is a bigger program in the Columbia River Basin. There is a PBS program on the similar problem of greater magnitude, because not only does it involve Oregon, Washington, it goes up into Canada. So it has a multinational agreement.
Yeah.
And they're doing many of the same things, but they have a bigger problem because Columbia River provides a major portion of the electricity for the Seattle, Portland area. And if you can search, I don't know what the title is, but if you can search the PBS passport system, I'm sure you can find the program, and it blows your mind away.
You remember roughly when that was shown?
I saw it about a year ago.
Okay,
Okay.
that helps. We'll have a peek at that.
You know, I think particularly with the larger programs, there's still a question, you know, how effective are the ladders? Even if you do the best remediation, isn't it still hard on the fish? And I think it is, but it does make it worthwhile for the dams that provide large amounts of the electricity to do all of the expensive modifications that are needed to stay in business. So I feel that dams that provide less electricity and create a big problem, I think it's quite reasonable to remove them. And I think that the public probably feels that way too. We have questions, of course, if they are a major supplier of the energy and obviously of clean energy, you know, what do we do when nature and our need for power come into conflict? So I don't have to make the decisions, so I'm glad.
Well, you know, some of the big lakes along the Colorado River system were so low that they had to, they were afraid the penstocks that would have a certain elevation of water above them would stop driving the generators. And so they had to run them, I think, at 50% or less of normal power. And so that's already happened due to climate change has affected the availability of hydroelectricity.
Well, I think this also brings up an interesting point about climate change. The West Coast, California in particular, has had tremendous drought.
Yeah.
But last year they had these oceanic rivers of rain, and they filled up a lot of the reservoirs that were previously, you know, really at very dangerous levels. But it's clear that we can't rely on a steady amount of rain. We don't know when it's going to be pouring buckets and then when we're going to have total shut off of the rain. Sorry. Yes, Steve.
The problem with that is most of that is west of the Rockies, and it doesn't affect the Colorado River watershed.
Okay.
Well, the Colorado River runs west from the height of land, Stephen. So why wouldn't it affect the west?
A lot of the watershed is flowing south, and
What you're talking about, the Colorado River?
yeah,
Yeah, but it's southwest. It ends up in the Gulf of California.
yes,
What's the name of that Gulf in
it
Mexico?
ends up trying to get to Mexico.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
But it doesn't always make it.
California.
yeah.
Yeah, although it's not, but obviously the reservoirs themselves, by virtue of being in California, some of them that are in California where they've gotten all the rain, those reservoirs have, you know,
Yes.
filled
They
up
overflowed. They overflowed a
Yeah.
number of those reservoirs because of the amount of rain.
Yeah.
But it did not affect. I'm a Grand Canyon
Oh, sure.
supporter, and we have not seen a lot of change in the water level in the Grand Canyon. And there is a I was offered to go on a boat, not a cruise, but a data finding tour down the river that I couldn't afford. But you know, they said they were concerned about the fact that they weren't getting a great increase in the water level, and it wasn't filling up many of the reservoirs that had impoundments.
Okay.
Right.
So
I
And
think
that,
that the water level, the water that came in past the West Coast was held up by the Sierra Nevadas, not by the Rockies.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
I think that's the point.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Doug. Thank you. Good point. Any other thoughts or questions? We're 10 after 11. We've got a wee bit of time, lots of time actually. Next week, I'm going to keep a broad topic, which will be more of a discussion, but I'll have some slides on, I call it oceanic perspectives. Gives me a lot of room, and I'm covering a wide range of things. So, but it'll be, as I say, more of a discussion. And then I'm going to be inviting you to think about this fall. I'd like to spend a little less time organizing this and invite more people to chip in your talks, your organizing skills and thoughts that we might discuss. So I welcome a lot of that. I will have a very broad list to share with you next week. I'll pass it around on mail, and please feel free to put in suggestions whether or not you want to lead a discussion, give a talk, or just provide an idea. I welcome that. And we have the summer off. There are apparently 6 groups of PLATO that go through the summer, but I like to go swimming in the summer. So I am quite happy to have the summer off and look forward to seeing you next weekend and this fall, and welcome your input. And thank you again, Dottie. That was, I thought, an excellent summary of a complicated subject. Appreciate your efforts. I'm sure we all do.
You
There is
begin
a
to
wiki-
realize how critical
thank you.
water is to human, planet, wildlife. Is it really
Yes.
a core element of our survival? And you realize that when they say, is there water on that planet? Because if not, nothing else is going to be there.
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Well, to put in a plug for nuclear, the planet is a lot better off because we've got molten potassium, uranium, and thorium in the center, making a nice magnetic field too. Water is good. Magnetic fields are just as good or better.
Not very drinkable.
That's true.
Yes.
You guys have a great, I'll have a great rest of the day. Enjoy this beautiful spring weather, and we'll see you next Monday.
Okay, bye.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
week.
Thanks, Dottie. Good job.
Yes.